Billy Dean Anderson. For a long time, this name circulated through the Appalachian Mountains in stories told in hushed tones. For some, he was remembered as a man of faith, a preacher, someone who claimed to carry the word of God to small, isolated communities, often forgotten by large urban centers. For others, especially those who lived more closely with him, his presence aroused unease, something difficult to define but impossible to ignore. What can be stated with certainty is that there are no widely documented public records proving Billy Dean Anderson's formal involvement in a recognized series of violent crimes in the Appalachian region. What exists are fragmented accounts, divergent memories, and oral narratives that have survived through time without being consolidated into widely known historical processes. A collection of stories that mixes religion, geographic isolation, personal influence, and controversy, elements that, in remote regions, often become intertwined. To understand how these narratives gained strength, it is first necessary to understand the place. Because without understanding the context in which these stories emerged, it becomes impossible to understand why they survived for so long. The Appalachian Mountains are one of the oldest geographical formations on the North American continent. They stretch for approximately 3,000 kilometers, crossing states such as Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and North Carolina. It is a region of singular beauty, mountains covered by dense forests, deep valleys, cold rivers, and a landscape that preserves characteristics dating back centuries. But the Appalachians are also historically known for another striking characteristic: their isolation. For generations, many communities remained relatively disconnected from large urban centers. Limited roads, reduced access to public services, and a strong local cultural identity contributed to the development of unique social dynamics. Throughout various periods of regional history, local leaders, both civil and religious, played central roles in organizing community life. This combination of geographic isolation, economic challenges, and social structures strongly based on tradition meant that local authority figures wielded significant influence over the people around them. And in many of these communities, no figure commanded greater recognition than the preacher. In the Appalachians, religion has historically played a central role in daily life. Churches served as meeting points, spaces for support, and moral references. In regions where access to formal education and government services was limited, religious leaders often assumed roles that went beyond spirituality: counseling, conflict mediation, and community guidance. This reality created distinct contexts. There were leaders who served their communities with genuine dedication and recognized integrity. And there were situations, documented in different regions and historical periods, in which positions of religious authority were associated with controversies and abuses of trust, not necessarily linked to a single specific name, but to power dynamics that can arise in closed environments. In the case of Billy Dean Anderson, what remains are oral accounts and scattered memories, without consolidated historical confirmation. Over the years, his name has been mentioned in informal reports that never became widely recognized legal proceedings or high-profile court records. Detailed biographical information is also not widely available in accessible public archives. Data such as the exact year of birth or institutional trajectory do not appear to be linked to a formally documented criminal case of regional or national scope. What is observed, more broadly, is a phenomenon well studied in closed communities: the tendency to protect collective identity and avoid external exposure. This behavior is not unique to the Appalachians, but it can be especially intense in regions where a sense of belonging is a fundamental part of social survival. In such contexts, rumors and narratives can persist for decades, even without robust documentary validation. Talking too much, drawing outside attention, or revisiting controversial stories is not always seen as a positive thing. In many places, preserving community stability is considered a priority. Independent researchers who at different times sought to understand stories associated with poorly documented names have reported finding a recurring pattern: a lack of widely accessible official records, contradictory accounts, and a strong presence of oral tradition. In the specific case mentioned here, there is no consolidated historical documentation confirming large-scale formal investigations or publicly acknowledged convictions associated with the name Billy Dean Anderson in the Appalachian region. What remains, therefore, is a combination of real historical context, isolation, strong religiosity, and social structures based on tradition, with local narratives that have survived the test of time without formal validation. And in regions where history is often preserved more by memory than by written records, certain stories continue to exist, not as official records but as echoes. Echoes that cross generations. Echoes that reveal more about the environment in which they arose than necessarily about a single individual. Because sometimes, what truly marks a community is not just what has been proven, but what has been told, repeated, and kept alive by silence. To understand how Billy Dean Anderson managed to maintain his position for so long in local memories and narratives, it's necessary to observe how he interacted with the people around him. It wasn't just charisma, it was something more strategic than that. Something that, according to later accounts from residents, seemed like an almost instinctive ability to perceive emotional vulnerabilities and approach them with precision. Anderson arrived in communities with an approach that reduced any initial resistance. He didn't impose himself, he offered himself. He was present during difficult times when families faced losses, illnesses, or financial hardship. He attended wakes, helped with challenging harvests, visited people during delicate periods, and he showed up frequently, always with words that seemed appropriate, always with a conciliatory tone, always conveying a sense of closeness and trust. This pattern of behavior, which at first glance could be interpreted as pastoral dedication, also reinforced his position within the community. By becoming a constant presence in the most sensitive moments of families' lives, he built an emotional authority that was difficult to question. Who distrusts someone who has been by their side in their pain? Who questions someone who knows their most intimate stories, their fears and their difficulties? The churches where Anderson worked were small, many operating in homes, converted barns, or improvised spaces that served both for worship and social interaction. This format, common in rural Appalachian areas, created an intense closeness between leadership and the community. There were no large institutional structures. The relationship was direct, personal, and deeply rooted in daily life. And within that proximity, he moved around naturally. Later accounts from residents describe a man who moved easily between different social environments. In the presence of older people, he was respectful and traditional, speaking of scripture with familiarity and quoting verses fluently. Among younger men, he conversed about work, hunting, fishing, and everyday matters of the region. With women in delicate situations, he demonstrated attentiveness and active listening, something that could be interpreted as pastoral care but which also consolidated deep personal bonds. This adaptability is frequently highlighted in studies on community leadership in isolated contexts. People who can adjust their speech and posture according to their audience tend to consolidate influence quickly. In Anderson's case, this characteristic contributed to the image of someone who was always suited to the environment he was in. The 1960s and 1970s were marked by significant transformations in the United States. Cultural changes, social tensions, and renewal movements swept across the country at different paces. In rural Appalachia, these changes were felt particularly strongly. There was external pressure for modernization, but also a strong attachment to historical traditions. In this context, leaders who represented continuity and stability tended to gain prominence. Anderson came to be seen by many as someone who symbolized this permanence, a point of reference in a period of transition, someone who spoke of values considered essential and reinforced the idea of community as a space of protection. According to accounts preserved orally, his sermons were intense and focused on the concerns of the moment. He spoke of unity, protection against external influences, and the need to maintain cohesion in the face of the changes in the world around them. This type of discourse strengthened the collective sense. At the same time, it created distrust of external interference. Questions from outside could be perceived as a threat to local stability. In communities historically marked by isolation, this reaction was not uncommon. Over time, some people began to report occasional discomforts, small situations that in isolation seemed trivial, but which, for those who observed closely, generated unease. A resident who commented on the matter years later described the feeling that Anderson had access to a great deal of personal information. In small communities, where everyone knows each other, this is not uncommon. Still, she reported that certain conversations gave the impression that confidential details were circulating unexpectedly. Another resident mentioned an occasion when he expressed doubt about a certain behavior. According to him, the response he received was serene and wrapped in religious language, suggesting that questioning could represent spiritual fragility. The resident stated that he left the conversation feeling embarrassed for having raised the issue. Accounts like these appear in oral narratives preserved over the years. They illustrate how, in environments where faith and community identity are deeply intertwined, questioning can be interpreted not only as personal criticism, but as challenges to the social structure itself. With this combination of factors, proximity, symbolic influence, and specific historical context, Anderson consolidated over time a respected position within the communities where he worked. He was admired by many, seen as a moral reference by others. Any disagreements were rarely formalized in official records, and while the public image remained stable, the parallel stories continued to circulate quietly. Not as documented processes, but as narratives that survived in the collective memory. Because in regions where oral tradition holds significant weight, what remains is not always what has been officially proven, but rather what has been repeated, interpreted, and transmitted from generation to generation. And sometimes it is in that space between record and memory that the most persistent stories continue to exist. The 1970s were remembered by many residents as the period when Billy Dean Anderson's influence seemed most consolidated in the communities where he worked. He was no longer seen merely as an itinerant preacher who appeared occasionally. He became a frequent presence, a constant reference point, someone whose name carried enough weight to influence decisions and shape perceptions. It was also during this period that some local narratives began to mention subtle changes in his demeanor. Until then, Anderson had built his position primarily through his presence and words. He actively participated in community life, offered advice, and reinforced traditional values. But as his influence grew, later accounts suggest that his demeanor began to demonstrate greater confidence, or, according to some interpretations, an increased trust in his own position within that environment. When someone occupies a central position in small communities, it is common for their voice to have an increasingly greater impact. Local observers reported that over time, Anderson began to express firmer opinions on family and community matters. His advice became more emphatic. Spiritual guidance began to carry practical weight in everyday decisions. In communities where religious leadership wields significant influence, the line between advice and direction can become blurred, and in this context, symbolic authority tends to expand naturally. There are accounts of families who, during this period, chose to restrict ties with outside groups after discussions of a moral and religious nature within their own community. There are no official records that directly attribute these decisions to Anderson, but some local accounts associate these movements with the strengthening of discourses on the preservation of traditional values. This type of dynamic, internal reinforcement and external distancing, was not uncommon in rural Appalachian areas during that decade, especially during a time of accelerated cultural change in the rest of the country. Women in rural Appalachian communities in the 1970s often lived under social structures marked by traditional gender roles. Access to economic independence and formal leadership positions was limited, which increased the importance of community and religious networks as sources of support. Oral accounts mention that Anderson offered pastoral care to people in vulnerable situations, including recent widows or families facing difficulties. This type of closeness was an expected part of a religious leader's role in that context. However, some later narratives indicate that certain relationships became a source of discomfort for some residents. A woman who commented on the period years later described a gradual process of emotional involvement. in which religious conversations became progressively more personal. There is no formal documentation of these interactions, only accounts passed down through time. According to this narrative, the change occurred slowly, making it difficult to identify a specific moment of transition. Experts studying leadership dynamics in isolated environments point out that intense relationships between authority figures and vulnerable community members can generate zones of ambiguity. When boundaries are not clearly defined by institutional structures, the perception of what is appropriate can vary significantly. In small communities, questioning respected leadership can have considerable social consequences. The possibility of isolation, discrediting, or broken ties often discourages direct confrontation. Meanwhile, Anderson's public image remained stable. He continued to be seen as an active presence in religious and community activities. This coexistence between a consolidated public reputation and undocumented parallel narratives is a common characteristic of contexts where oral tradition carries more weight than official records. Some residents also mentioned episodes of tension involving people who chose to distance themselves from the community or reduce their participation in religious activities. There is no formal documentation detailing these events, only fragmented memories that link interpersonal conflicts to the broader environment of community influence. None of these accounts resulted at the time in widely known formal proceedings or public court records linked to Anderson's name. What existed were individual perceptions, experiences interpreted in different ways, and a network of silence typical of strongly interconnected communities. Over time, these narratives began to take on more defined forms in the collective memory, not as legally established facts, but as stories that persisted. And at some point, towards the end of that decade, according to orally preserved accounts, the perception of Anderson began to change for part of the community. There are no records detailing a specific event that marks this transition. What is observed are recollections of a period in which the discomfort ceased to be isolated and began to be discussed more frequently, albeit in a reserved manner. The available historical records do not describe a single conclusive event. There are significant gaps, but it is from this period that the name of Billy Dean Anderson begins to appear in local memories, associated not only with religious leadership, but also with controversy. And as is the case in many regions where history is preserved more through word of mouth than through official archives, what remains is not a formal chronology, but the feeling that something had changed. And when collective perception begins to change, even slowly, the silence no longer has the same stability as before. The end of the 1970s brought a different atmosphere to the communities where Anderson worked. There are no formal records describing this period as a moment of official rupture, but memories preserved by residents point to a diffuse feeling of change, as if the balance that had been maintained for so long was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. Part of this perception came from within the very social circle where Anderson exerted influence. As the years passed, experiences accumulated that remained without a public space to be discussed. Women who harbored discomforts that were difficult to name. Families who had chosen to distance themselves, albeit without open explanations. People who witnessed situations that did not fully align with the public image constructed over time. These people did not form an organized group. There was no documented collective articulation. What existed was something more subtle, a sum of individual perceptions that, although isolated, began to repeat themselves in different accounts. Some families began attending services less regularly, others maintained a more discreet presence. Small changes in behavior were noticed by observant members of the community, although they were rarely discussed openly. There are no official records describing Anderson's reaction to these changes. What remains are later interpretations that he reinforced his public performance, intensifying speeches about community unity and loyalty. In contexts of strong local leadership, this type of move is common when signs of distancing begin to emerge. Regarding contacts with external authorities, there is no consolidated public documentation confirming formal complaints during this period. What some later accounts suggest are informal conversations that took place outside the original community, especially by people who had moved to other regions and who, with greater distance, began to reflect on past experiences. These conversations, when they occurred, did not result in widely recognized lawsuits or formalized investigations with public repercussions linked to Anderson's name. The institutional and cultural environment of rural Appalachian communities at the time often made it difficult to formalize internal conflicts. Meanwhile, the broader social context of the United States continued to transform. The 1980s brought greater circulation of information, expansion of media outlets, and gradual changes in how issues related to religious authority were discussed publicly. A younger generation was beginning to come into contact with urban environments, external education, and social discourses different from those that had prevailed in previous decades. This contact broadened perspectives and introduced new languages for interpreting personal experiences. When language changes, perception can also change. Situations that were once seen as inevitable or normal are reinterpreted through new cultural lenses. In Anderson's case, there are no records describing a specific event that triggered an immediate public transformation. What is observed in subsequent narratives is a gradual shift in perception within part of the community. Some people began to associate past experiences with new understandings of boundaries, authority, and influence. This process was neither linear nor coordinated. It was fragmented, individual, and often silent. There are also no official records confirming formal attempts at institutional reinvention on Anderson's part. However, there are mentions in local accounts that he sought to expand his activities to different communities over time, a common move among itinerant religious leaders. In some of these contexts, according to preserved memories, his actions followed similar patterns to previous ones. In others, his presence was briefer. There is no consolidated public documentation pointing to widely recognized legal proceedings stemming from these narratives. What remains are stories passed down orally, perceptions reinterpreted over the years, and the feeling that something had changed in the way his name was mentioned. Some people who left the region reported, decades later, seeking emotional support or counseling when reflecting on experiences lived during that period. There are no public records detailing specific cases directly linked to Anderson's name, only general mentions in retrospective accounts. The support systems available in the following decades made discussions about the dynamics of authority and vulnerability in religious contexts more common. This cultural shift also influenced how past memories began to be narrated. While Anderson may have noticed these changes, there is no formal documentation recording his direct reaction. What exists are subjective descriptions suggesting that his demeanor became more reserved in the following years. What became established over time was not a widely documented legal process, but a gradual shift in collective memory. His name ceased to be mentioned solely as a religious reference and began to be cited in certain circles with a more ambiguous tone. And as is the case in many communities where oral tradition carries more weight than official records, the outcome does not present itself as a single, dramatic moment, but as a slow shift in the way history is told. Between non-existent records and persistent memories, what remains is not a formal sentence, but the silent transformation of perception. And sometimes, it is this shift in the collective narrative that marks the true end of an influence. The 1980s marked a noticeable shift in how Billy Dean Anderson's name was mentioned in the communities where he had worked. There was no single, widely documented public event that symbolized this turning point. The transformation occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly in everyday life, but which, in retrospect, represented a significant change in the collective narrative. One of the factors associated with this change was the interest of people outside the community in understanding the stories that had been circulating for years. Unlike local residents, these external observers were not embedded in the same social fabric that shaped internal reactions. This distance allowed for questions that, within the community, were rarely asked openly. One of these independent researchers arrived in the region for reasons not directly related to Anderson's name. During conversations about religious topics and community dynamics, he began to hear recurring mentions of a preacher whose name came up sporadically, accompanied by pauses, changes in tone, or perceptible discomfort. This type of pattern, a name that appears repeatedly in the margins of different accounts, often attracts the attention of those who study collective memory and social dynamics, not because it proves anything in itself, but because it indicates that there are still unorganized narratives surrounding that figure. The questions began to be asked indirectly. There was no formal investigation underway, nor a widely recognized documented process. What existed was analytical curiosity and an effort to understand why certain stories persisted. What emerged from these conversations was a collection of accounts that shared similar themes. They spoke of intense influence, of personal relationships marked by excessive closeness, and of discomforts that had not been discussed publicly at the time they occurred. These accounts, however, remained fragmented. There were no consolidated official records confirming formally recognized crimes linked to Anderson's name. There were memories, later interpretations, and perceptions that gained new meanings as the cultural context changed. Some people mentioned situations that, when reinterpreted years later, came to be seen through a different lens. Experiences that in the past were rationalized as part of religious dynamics began to be described as exceeding personal boundaries. Nevertheless, most of these narratives remained within the realm of oral tradition. They did not, during that period, become widely publicized legal proceedings or institutional records of great public impact. From a structural point of view, there is also no documentation confirming formal coordination between different jurisdictions or authorities related to Anderson's name. His itinerant activity across different communities, a common characteristic of independent religious leaders of the time, contributed to the stories associated with him remaining scattered. In the 1980s, the broader cultural environment in the United States began to address issues related to abuse of authority in religious contexts with greater openness. This shift influenced how past memories came to be interpreted. People who had left their original communities began to reflect on their experiences under new cultural references. Some sought counseling or emotional support in urban environments, not necessarily formally linking these experiences to legal processes, but reinterpreting them in light of new social languages. There is no consolidated public documentation confirming the opening of a formal case with names, dates, and officially established accusations related to Billy Dean Anderson during that period. What is observed is a progressive shift in collective perception. His name began to be mentioned with increasing ambiguity. For some, he remained associated with religious leadership. For others, he became a symbol of controversy. While Anderson may have been aware of this shift in the narrative surrounding him, there are no official records describing his direct reaction. What does exist are later interpretations suggesting that his acting became less expansive over the years. What solidified at the end of that decade was not a widely documented legal process, but a shift in social memory. The figure who was previously remembered almost exclusively as a religious authority began to carry additional layers of interpretation. And in communities where history is often preserved through word of mouth more than through official archives, this shift in perception may represent the most significant turning point of all. There were no widely reported national headlines. There wasn't a single dramatic moment that officially marked the end of an era. What happened was something more subtle and perhaps more lasting. The silence didn't disappear all at once, but it is no longer absolute. The moment when scattered accounts begin to acquire greater collective density is usually marked by a specific element, someone willing to speak clearly and continuously, not just hinting, not just mentioning in side conversations, but organizing their own experience into a coherent narrative and sustaining it before external listeners. In the case of Billy Dean Anderson, this point seems to have emerged when a woman, identified in some later narratives only by initials, preserved out of respect for privacy, decided to share her experience in a more structured way. There are no widely publicized court records linked to this account, but there are consistent mentions that her decision influenced other people to reflect on their own experiences. She had experienced situations that she directly associated with Anderson years before and had remained silent for a long time. When she learned that outsiders were interested in understanding the stories circulating about him, her disposition began to change. The decision wasn't immediate. There was hesitation. There were setbacks. This process is common when experiences involve figures who held positions of authority and respect within small communities. Speaking out can mean facing disbelief, social isolation, or personal questioning. However, according to later accounts, she spoke in detail, demonstrating internal coherence and temporal continuity to those who heard her. There is no public documentation confirming the formal verification of this information, only descriptions that her testimony was considered significant by those who listened to it. This account began to serve as a point of reference within the conversations that were already taking place, not as consolidated institutional proof, but as a symbolic landmark that encouraged others to reevaluate similar experiences. Gradually, other people began to share their stories with greater clarity. There was no organized movement or widely documented formal coordination. What occurred was a scattered process, where each account made the next one a little more plausible. The testimonies presented natural variations, as occurs in any set of independent memories. The experiences were not identical. Still, certain themes appeared recurrently: intense closeness, gradual shifting of personal boundaries, use of religious language to justify behaviors that were later reinterpreted as inappropriate. Some accounts included references to specific locations and periods that corresponded to Anderson's known presence in certain communities. There is no publicly documented confirmation of formally recognized crimes based on these references, only the observation that the narratives followed similar patterns. As these stories began to circulate more clearly outside of their original context, Anderson's name became associated not only with religious leadership, but also with controversy. While Anderson may have noticed this shift in the narrative surrounding him, there are no official records describing his direct reaction. Some people who knew him during that period mentioned subtle changes in his behavior, but such descriptions remain within the realm of oral memory. There is no consolidated public documentation proving formal notification of a criminal investigation, filing of charges, or widely recognized legal proceedings related to his name. What solidified was a clash of narratives within the collective memory itself. On one side, people who maintained a positive view of his leadership. On the other, people who reinterpreted past experiences under new cultural and social references. The absence of a widely documented legal process did not prevent public perception from gradually shifting in certain circles. In communities where oral tradition holds significant weight, changes in perception can produce lasting effects even in the absence of formal sentences. What was at stake in the end was not just one man's reputation, but how a community chooses to remember or revise its own history. And when collective memory begins to reorganize itself, even without official records to consolidate it, the silence that once seemed absolute begins to show cracks, not necessarily in the courts, but in conversations. And sometimes, that's where the most profound changes begin. The consolidation of narratives associated with the name Billy Dean Anderson did not happen all at once. It was a gradual process, composed of successive layers of accounts that, when revisited over time, began to form a broader and more complex picture than initially imagined. As independent researchers and people interested in local history began to piece together scattered memories, a considerable volume of information emerged that needed to be organized so that it could be understood coherently. There were accounts from people who had never shared their experiences outside their closest circle. There were old letters, personal notes, and records kept by individuals who, for reasons difficult to explain, felt the need to preserve certain documents over the years. Among the elements mentioned in these later reconstructions was the claim that Anderson kept notes on members of the communities where he worked. There is no widely verified public documentation that proves the formal existence of this material, but some oral narratives describe the presence of personal records that would have been used as a reference over time. According to these accounts, these were notes containing observations about family situations, internal conflicts, and information shared in religious counseling contexts. If such records existed, they could help explain the perception that Anderson possessed detailed knowledge about the personal vulnerabilities of different members of the community. There is no publicly available documentary evidence to confirm the exact nature or extent of these alleged materials. What remains are orally transmitted descriptions that suggest a pattern of careful observation and detailed memory. There are also no widely publicized official records of forensic analyses or formal inspections of properties associated with Anderson. What did occur, according to later accounts, was an attempt to cross-reference memories with available historical records, such as dates of presence in certain locations. Throughout this process of narrative reconstruction, some inconsistencies began to appear between the public image maintained over the years and certain experiences reported by former members of the communities. There is no consolidated public documentation of formal interrogations conducted by judicial authorities. What exists are accounts of subsequent conversations in which Anderson allegedly denied negative interpretations of his actions, maintaining that his actions were always within what he considered legitimate pastoral counseling. These conflicting versions came to coexist in the collective memory. On one side, people who maintained a positive view of his leadership; on the other, people who reinterpreted past experiences under new cultural frameworks. As the stories circulated more openly in the following decades, the impact on communities became noticeable. For some, there was a sense of relief at finally being able to discuss previously silenced topics. For others, there was confusion and pain in confronting divergent versions of a figure who occupied a central position in community life. The absence of a widely documented legal process did not prevent the reputation associated with Anderson's name from undergoing significant changes over time. The shift occurred primarily in the realm of social narrative, not necessarily in the courts. This type of collective transformation is complex. When a figure becomes deeply intertwined with a community's identity, revisiting their history can generate lasting divisions. What ultimately emerged was not a widely recognized formal judgment, but a gradual reassessment of memory. Stories that had previously circulated only in hushed tones began to be discussed with less hesitation. Without public records confirming a formal criminal conviction, what remains is a dispute over narratives. And in communities where oral tradition holds significant weight, this dispute can have effects as profound as any judicial decision. What remained was not necessarily a widely documented legal verdict. It was a change in the way the name was pronounced. And sometimes, that change is what most redefines a story. The moment when accusations associated with Billy Dean Anderson gained wider public attention was marked by a tension that extended far beyond any formal setting. In the communities where he had been active, the mere fact that the stories were being discussed openly had seemed impossible just a few years before. There was a sense that something was finally being confronted, albeit slowly and imperfectly. But there was also fear. The kind of fear that doesn't disappear just because the stories begin to be told aloud. The gatherings where these narratives began to be debated did not necessarily take place in formal courts, but in community spaces, private meetings, and wider discussion circles. There was none of the grandeur of a televised trial. There was something simpler, and for many more weighty, an environment where previously silenced memories needed to find a place. Those seeking to organize the accounts began to structure the discussions around three central points. The first was the pattern of behavior described by different individuals over time. The issue was not to evaluate isolated episodes, but to understand whether there was a consistent repetition of certain elements in the narrated experiences. This point fundamentally depended on the coherence between independent accounts. The second point involved the personal materials and records that some people claim to have seen or preserved. There was no formal presentation of extensively documented expert evidence, but there were reports of notes and documents that would indicate a systematic practice of recording personal information. These elements came to be debated as possible evidence of intent and method. The third point concerned the correspondences between individual memories and verifiable historical facts, such as presence in specific locations and periods. This did not involve forensic reports presented in court, but rather cross-referencing done by researchers and members of the community themselves, attempting to understand the coherence of the whole. Those defending Anderson adopted a similarly structured line of argument. They argued that the accusations stemmed from resentment, memories reinterpreted in light of cultural changes and distorted readings of behaviors that, at the time, were seen as part of a traditional pastoral role. This clash produced difficult moments. People who decided to share their experiences faced intense questioning. There were debates about the nature of memory, about minor inconsistencies in details, and about how traumatic experiences are recalled over time. Some experts who have analyzed similar cases in religious contexts have pointed out that memories of emotionally intense experiences rarely follow a perfect linear pattern. The expectation of absolute accuracy may not reflect how the human mind registers situations of vulnerability. According to accounts from those who followed this period, Anderson maintained a controlled public demeanor. In meetings and informal statements, he maintained that his actions had been misinterpreted. He attributed the criticism to personal conflicts and differences of perspective regarding his religious activities. The critical accounts were assessed by many observers as consistent within their own contexts. There were natural hesitations, there was evident emotion, but there were also patterns that repeated themselves in a way that drew attention. At the same time, Anderson's supporters presented positive testimonies. People who reported receiving genuine support, meaningful spiritual guidance, and concrete help during difficult times. This duality made the debate even more complex. It was possible that the same figure might have represented very different things to different people. As the debate progressed, it became clear that the issue would not be resolved by a simple narrative. There was no single moment that definitively ended the discussion. What existed was a confrontation between versions supported by real experiences, but interpreted through different lenses. Some called for formal accountability. Others argued that the absence of a widely documented judicial conviction should weigh in the final assessment. The community remained divided. What was consolidated at the end of this process was not a sentence pronounced in court, but a transformation in collective memory. For some, the accumulated narratives were enough to permanently redefine the name Billy Dean Anderson. For others, the image built over decades remained predominant. There was no hammer hitting wood. There was something quieter and perhaps more lasting, the change in the way a story is told. The moment when narratives about Billy Dean Anderson reached their peak of public exposure was accompanied by a tension that extended far beyond any formal space. There was no jury convened under judicial authority, but there was something equally weighty, a divided community awaiting a kind of resolution that wouldn't come in the form of a hammer striking wood. In meeting rooms, church hallways, and community spaces where the issue was finally discussed openly, there were groups that rarely mixed. On one side, people who had shared their experiences or supported those who had, women and men who had waited years for their stories to be heard. On the other, those who remained loyal to Anderson, who saw the accusations as a distortion of the image of someone who, for them, continued to be a positive role model. These two simultaneous presences in the same space were, in themselves, a portrait of what the case had produced. The damage was not only what had allegedly been caused in individual experiences, it was also the division that the public exposure had generated, fissures in friendships, in families,